Joining me today are two very special guests, Robert Bauval and Tom Brophy. Robert is the originator of the Orion mystery, the Orion theory, published in 1994. He introduced the world to a highly original, now internationally famous star correlation theory about the Giza pyramids in Egypt, and sent a huge shockwave of controversy throughout the scientific community, which we still feel the effects of today. Tom Brophy is a PhD from the University of Colorado, was a staff research scientist at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, in Boulder, Colorado. And he has a background in work for NASA. He's going to share with us today some of his concepts on the findings at Nabta Playa in Egypt. The prehistoric astronomy of Nabta Playa is considered to hold astonishing aspects, enduring enigmas, and recent finds, which they both write in a new book called Black Genesis. We have a lot of information to cover in this next hour, so stay tuned. And I'd like to welcome officially my guests, Robert and Tom. Hello, welcome.
Hello, Hillary.
So I have questions for both of you, but I'd like your opinions on some of the topics we're going to be sharing today. And so we're going to begin, Robert, with you. And I know that you have a very wonderful explanation of this hard physical evidence of an Egyptian civilization that predates Egypt. So why don't you just begin by telling us what it is that the Black Genesis book that that's coming out is really all about.
Well, Black Genesis, which Tom Brophy and I have written over the last year and a half, has a very long background. I'll be as brief as possible. It involves the Eastern Sahara, or as we prefer to call it, the Egyptian Sahara, where in the last 30 years have been discovered various sites. One of them particularly, which Tom is more into that, is the Nabta Playa site, which is about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, in the extreme south of Egypt. And the other sites, which we'll be talking about in the course of this hour, are in the extreme southwest of Egypt, in a place called Gilf Kibir and Jebel Uwaynat. Now, the evidence that has emerged over the last 30 years, and which Tom and I have compiled and interpreted, is that there existed for thousands of years, before the pharaonic civilization, a culture, a prehistoric culture, that had settled in the Sahara, in the Egyptian Sahara, and has left its fingerprints all over the place, but particularly in Nabta Playa. And what has emerged from this investigation is that they practiced certain sciences, such as astronomy and the moving of large blocks, the sort of rudimentary architecture, and certain ideologies that are evident at Nabta Playa, that confirms to us, and now has become rather general with most Egyptologists and anthropologists, that these people are the precursors of the Egyptian civilization, or perhaps even the pre-ancient Egyptians themselves. So this is, in a nutshell, what Black Genesis is all about. And of course, the title tells it all. These prehistoric people were black. We have evidence of this from their rock art that they left in the mountain regions of Gilf Kibir.
Tom, I'd like to ask you how you got into all of this, considering your background. What was this like for you to get involved with this expedition?
Well, it was fascinating. I started studying Nabta Playa after a paper on it came out in Nature magazine. I think it was in 1998 that first came out. And I had started looking into archaeoastronomy of Egypt. In Egypt, one of the first things I did was, when I had some time to do a research project, was to test Robert's Orion correlation theory of the Great Pyramids, because my PhD research I did some related dynamical modeling, computer modeling of the way stars move. So that's how I got started studying archaeoastronomy, actually. And then this Nabta site came up, and there was a reason why I was looking in that region anyway. And the data that was in that Nature article was very sketchy, and it was only very partially explained in that article. So there was much left to be explained as to what was really going on at that site. So I just started modeling it and approaching it as a puzzle as to what sort of astronomy the people were looking at there. And the studies just sort of went on from there. It turned out there was a lot to do still, because there were some problems with the initial data, and so.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're breaking up on this end.
Okay. And so anyhow, I ended up taking more data, going on site to take GPS measurements and satellite imagery measurements, and even more recently, I got my colleague who is still at Jet Propulsion Laboratory to help with studies of ground penetrating radar. So anyhow, we just continued measuring the site and interpreting it, and it all came together in along with all this other cultural evidence from the desert region that Robert was talking about, that we put together in this book, Black Genesis.
Robert, why do you think there's such an ongoing fascination with these ancient cultures and the stars?
Yeah, before I answer this question, Hillary, let me just add a bit to what Tom said. The broker, in a sense, that brought us together is John West. I'm sure you know John. He contacted me in the early 2000s, telling me about Tom. And Tom and I eventually met in San Diego. I think it was 2003 or 4, Tom, wasn't it? I can't remember. And
yeah,
this led us to realize that the research that Tom had done, the extensive astronomical research he had done, coupled with the various lines of research that I had done on ancient Egypt, would perfectly match and bring us together for a full-scale investigation on this lost culture. And finally what happened is that in 2007, two friends of mine discovered inscriptions in this remote region of the southwest of Egypt, in Jebel Uwainat. Now, let me just give a picture of the area. From the Nile at Abu Simbel, if you go due west, you will reach Jebel Uwainat after 700 kilometers. It's really very, very far away, and even today it's quite an expedition to go with four-wheel drives, let alone in ancient Egyptian times. And Egyptologists were absolutely adamant that the pharaohs, or nobody in fact, had gone to these regions prior to modern times, prior to the invention of the vehicle. So they were stuck on this position until two explorers that I know, Mark Borda and Mahmoud Marai, an Egyptian, went to this remote place at Uwainat, and lo and behold, they discovered pharaonic inscriptions dating from the Old Kingdom, which proved once and for all that the pharaohs went there. Now, what's very interesting is that the pharaohs seem to have gone to the place where their ancestors had originated, a sort of meet the ancestors type of place. And so I called Tom and I said, listen, we've got to go there. And one thing led to another, and we actually did mount an expedition in April 2008, and we went there. Perhaps we'll tell you a bit more about it during the interview, but it was quite a trip. And it allowed Tom and I to discuss a lot of the material that we had piled up through the years during this expedition, because we had long nights and plenty of time to do that. And that is the genesis, if you like, of Black Genesis.
Robert, let me ask you another question.
What was the other question you asked?
That's okay. Let me ask you another question before we continue on with my first question. I'm curious if this culture infiltrated ancient Egypt through what some call the Nubian queen or the 18th dynasty queens. When they came in, there's some question that maybe there was some Nubian connections. Do you feel that this culture may have in fact been connected in this way?
Okay, I'll take this one, Tom. Let me give you some dates here, because the culture we're talking about probably came down into the Egyptian Sahara, which, by the way, was extremely fertile in prehistoric times. That's why they went there. And we think around perhaps 10, 12,000 BC. And they lingered there and eventually settled in Napta Playa, where there is this famous ceremonial astronomical site, around perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 BC. And when the Sahara began to get super arid and humans could not live there anymore, which was around 4,000 BC, give or take a few hundred years, it is obvious that these people went to the Nile Valley, which was only 100 kilometers further east. And they came in there. God knows what they found. We're not quite sure what was there. They probably were hunter-gatherers and some people living in the valley. And they imported not only their cargo of knowledge, but they imported their genetic origin, which was black Africans. And I have no doubt in my mind that the Nubians that eventually are recorded in history, like you mentioned, certainly the 18th dynasty and so forth. And today, as a matter of fact, there's a lot of black Nubians that live in the area, are descendants from this prehistoric culture. So that's the broad picture. What happened afterwards is another matter. There was a lot of import in Egypt, but we're talking about much later times, where Mediterranean people and people from the Levant and various other regions, and the whole racial origins got mixed, like it happened around the globe, by the way. I'd like to say this, and then I'll hand over to Tom. It is a matter of fact, not a matter of theory, that we all have our origins in Central Africa, in East Africa to be more precise. We started all there, and we are all from that racial origins. We are, if you like, blacks turned white, if one has to put it this way. We all have that origin. This is now a fact. I mean, it's well documented in genetic studies and cultural studies and anthropological studies. So, yes, to answer your question, yes, Nubians are from that source, from that batch.
Tom, I have a question for you. You have something in your work called an origin map that talks about the calibration of the zodiac and the Yuga cycle. Would you care to comment on how this work relates to what we're discussing?
Well, sure. That book, The Origin Map, contains some of my early studies of the Napta Playa astronomy, and also, as I mentioned, the reworking, retesting of the Giza Plateau astronomy. And I found what I think is suggestions of a tracking of the Yuga, what's known as the Yuga cycle, which is the ancient Indian name for the precession cycle, and also associated with the cycle of cultural development that goes through the high time, the Satya Yuga, and the low time, the Kali Yuga, high or low, depending on how you define them, material-oriented or spiritual-oriented times. And that's a connection that's made in that book. And actually, I mentioned it in my first book called "The Mechanism, Demands, and Mysticism," where I explored the sort of openness of modern physical science paradigms to the reconnection with the spiritual aspects of the universe. And these cycles, that there are hints of ancient peoples tracking them in their monumental astronomy is what I describe in the Origin map.
Robert, would you care to comment also on why these astrological alignments were so important to pre-cultures?
Yes, as you mentioned in the introduction, my thing is ancient astronomy and ancient Egypt. I developed the theory of the Orion correlation theory, which shows that the pyramids of Giza are in correlation. The pattern is in correlation to the three stars of Orion's belt. Now, there is a lot of circumstantial evidence and astronomical evidence and textual evidence that supports very strongly this correlation. But you have to look at it from the context of the time. Now, and also the geographical conditions. I think both of these points have to be very carefully considered. Now, regarding the Giza pyramids and the attempt to somehow link that zone of the sky, the Orion zone of the sky, to the pyramid zone, stems from the fact that Egypt is very much a cyclical kind of geographical location. Now, we all know of the seasons, of course, and each one of us, depending where we live in the world, knows the variation of the seasons and the cycles that we undergo through the year. But in Egypt, there was something else that made this annual cycle much more pronounced, much more dramatic, and that was the annual flooding of the Nile. The Nile would, and still does, by the way, floods around the end of June. The water starts rising, and in ancient times, before they built the dams, today there are dams in Upper Egypt that block the flood. But before the dams, the water would reach all the way to the Mediterranean, the flood waters, and it would naturally irrigate the land as it broke through the banks and water the adjacent land. And this created a natural hydraulic system that Egypt was literally fertilized by this mystical flood. And the crops would grow and so forth. So in a sense, the flood was the vascular vein, the lifeblood of Egypt. Without the flood, Egypt would not probably have existed the way it had. So the focus was on this flood and how to explain the flood, because they didn't know the origins of the Nile. They didn't know where the water came from, let alone why it came in the height of summer, which you would expect the water of the Nile to ebb rather than rise. So this whole focus on the Nile made them look at the sky. They tried to look for an explanation of the sky, because the sky obviously has the same cycles. The stars move in a yearly pattern. The sun, of course, changes position throughout the year and so forth. And they noticed that prior to the flood, there would be a kind of cosmic herald, if you like, a cosmic signal. And that was the apparition of the constellation of Orion, and followed by the bright star Sirius. And around that, a whole religious mythology developed. Now, we thought that this was original to the pharaohs. And I think Tom will elaborate on this. The surprise has come when Naphtali was discovered in the 1970s, and later when it was studied from an astronomical point of view in the late 1990s. The surprise came when the astronomy of Naphtali, which is thousands of years before the pyramids, contained the very same astronomical alignments. The site has alignments to Orion's belt, to Sirius, and suddenly we became extremely aware that it wasn't the Egyptians, or it wasn't the pharaohs that we thought had originated all this. It came from these prehistoric people. I'm going to let Tom elaborate on this Naphtha astronomy, because he's much more into that. I mean, I've studied it as well, but I think he can tell you more. But it is that specific point that raised the alarm. There is something before the pharaohs, and that something is at Naphtha. Go ahead, Tom.
Sure. Tom, before you elaborate, I'd like you to also comment on why these pyramids are found globally, all over the world in ancient cultures. It doesn't just exist within Egypt. It's all over the planet. And I'd like you to comment, if you will, on not only the astrology of this particular site and within Egypt, but how it relates to a global sense of understanding.
Well, for one thing, Robert Schoch did a book about the globe, about pyramids around the globe, which is interesting. And there is clearly we find ancient pyramids around the globe. So we can take two tracks of explaining that. Perhaps they were developed. These type of monumental architecture was developed independently because it reflects something in nature that is sort of independently discoverable, like all science is. Or perhaps there was relations, travel, a global culture of some sort. Either one of those two.
Do you feel that there was some kind of catastrophe? I know we're kind of moving off my original question was, but do you feel that there was some kind of global, the biblical flood or some kind of global catastrophe that caused, some kind of, a culture that was highly advanced to be left with the basics and trying to rebuild from that as best they could? Because sometimes it feels to me that, and Robert, you can elaborate and answer on this too if you like, that these cultures were coming back from something where they already had this very advanced knowledge. And Robert, in your books, you touch on the concept of Atlantis and this global-like place of, higher understandings and already advanced technology and understandings. Tom, do you feel that this was the case, that there was some kind of global shift or change or catastrophe, lots of theories on it, I know, that caused this to happen, and they were kind of rebuilding their coordinates, so to speak, with the sky?
Well, in Black Genesis, actually, we do touch on that. In Black Genesis, we sort of have a dual approach. We make firm this connection of around, in time-wise, the pre-dynastic period, 3500 BC and earlier, to the North African Saharan desert, which was then not desert but was temperate climate, including Naphtha. And then we also review and make some new points about the what Robert has called in his previous books the first time in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, which was much earlier, around 11,000 BC. And now we know from climatology that there was around that time major global climate change and major sea level rise of, I forget, many tens of meters or more. So we do know there was physical climate change, and this Yuga cycle, it turns out, also had independently a sort of inflection point or moving through the high time at that same time. So we kind of in this new book we kind of start making more all the connections through time, going back further in time towards that first time.
Robert, you care to comment?
Yeah. What I'd like to say, and I always say this when I'm asked a question like this, is that there is no reason at all why a high culture did not pre-exist our historical view of human civilization. I remember a phrase that a very prominent astronomer once told me, Professor Archie Roy in Glasgow University. He said there were Einsteins and Newtons and geniuses, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. There's no reason at all why geniuses such as these great scientists that we know in our times did not exist in those days. The only difference, I think, that seems to be the case is that they perhaps didn't have the science and the technology we have, and therefore they developed in a very different way. They searched inwardly rather than outwardly. And they might have developed an extremely high knowledge, a sort of gnosis, I would say, a kind of great wisdom, of which we have lost. And to me, it's always been the case where I feel that there is a lost wisdom, a lost knowledge that clearly, even when we look at historical Egypt, such as the pyramids, for example, screams at you. Not just the mystery of the place, but the technology that they use. So, I wouldn't put it out of the question that there was some high culture floating about which we haven't detected. And here we are, at least finding its first fingerprints, if it existed. I mean, Nabta Playa, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, I think we both feel the same, is the fingerprints of a culture that was long regarded as primitive, and with the evidence that we're unmasking, they were a long way from being primitive. In fact, they seem to have been far more sophisticated than the early Egyptians. They practiced a very sophisticated astronomy. They seem to have tracked one of the most difficult things to do in astronomy, which is tracking the precession of the equinox, the moving of stars over a long period of time, and in a very, very difficult geographical condition. I mean, if you go to Nabta Playa, you will realize that it's not the easiest place to do this sort of stuff, moving stones. And so I think that what Tom and I have found in a very physical way is literally the fingerprints, the footprints, the legacy of that sophisticated culture that we see in Nabta Playa.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of fill in 2 points around that, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
You were mentioning before the Old Kingdom use of the reappearance of Sirius every year, the bright star Sirius, to herald the flooding of the Nile, very important in ancient Egypt. And the early Old Kingdom temples were aligned towards Sirius, and even changed their alignment as they were rebuilt, as Sirius's position changed through precession. And now we find in Nabta Playa the megalithic, the large stone alignments, also tracking Sirius, the star Sirius, in the same sort of way, and just earlier than the earliest Old Kingdom temples along the Nile were, and also simultaneously tracking at Nabta the rising of Sirius with the rising with a north circumpolar star, or one of the stars that we call the Big Dipper, or the ancient Egyptians called the Thigh constellation, and that we find repeated at Nabta just centuries before and leading up to the time when Nabta suddenly became hyper-arid, extreme desert like it is now, and the people clearly, the culture clearly, and probably actually the people moved from there to the Nile and began the Egyptian civilization. Then, if we take even further back in time, what we find at Nabta, there's something very interesting and something still mysterious there, called bedrock sculptures. Sculpted stones that are on the bedrock that's underneath meters, say 3 meters, 10 feet or so, of playa sediments that came into the playa as the playa filled up seasonally with water when it was raining, before it was extreme desert. And that sedimentation period was from the end of the last ice age up until about 3,500 BC, when it became extreme desert. And the fact that there are found at Nabta underneath those sediments, sculpted onto the bedrock, these mysterious sculptures that are associated with the star-aligned large stones, megaliths, that are on top of the playa sediments, is still mysterious as to what those bedrock sculptures are and who created them and how ancient they really are. Because, the first sort of approximation would be that they were sculpted before the sediments that were laid down on top of them. But that is, sort of outside the normally accepted range of when ancient people were doing that sort of thing. But even so, so a little story around that is that, so the archaeologists who were excavating this site, when they found these bedrock sculptures associated with the surface on top of the sediment megaliths, they were very puzzled by that and came up with various hypotheses, saying that somehow the Neolithic people around 5,000 BC, when the sedimentation stopped happening, figured out where those bedrock lumps were, and they dug down through the sediments and sculpted those lumps of bedrock, and then filled the sediments back in, and then put the arrangement of megaliths on top of the sediments. It was sort of convoluted reasoning to keep it within the accepted range of when Neolithic people were doing that sort of thing. More recently, even those scholars have accepted that it's likely that was not what happened, but those bedrock sculptures are more ancient, and their association with the surface sculptures was maintained through time over the millennium, and so this is a remaining mystery that we're just starting to make the connections to at Nabta that brings or takes this mysterious culture that was the precursor to ancient Egyptian civilization even further back in time.
I want to ask a question, and I'd like both of you to comment briefly on this. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit to our previous discussion of the 18th dynasty queens and their Nubian connection. And I know that it's common knowledge that knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter. It was more of a matriarchal system. And I'd like to know both of your personal insights or opinions on why you think we switched from a matriarchal society to more of a patriarchal society. Robert, let's start with you.
Whoops. Well, it is true that certainly the ancient Egyptians, the historical period throughout the ancient Egypt, placed women, and particularly women divinities, in a very prominent position. We have many ancient Egyptian goddesses, or rather I would like to see them as principle of the divine feminine. I think that's a better way of looking at them. But we have goddesses, of course, like Isis, who became a universal goddess. The cult of Isis was not just practiced in Egypt for 3,000 years, but eventually it was exported in the Roman Empire and stretched all the way to Europe. We find temples of Isis all the way to England. The cult of Hathor, the cult of the sky goddess Nut, and a variety of others. One of the great goddesses of Egypt was also the goddess Seshat, who was responsible for the alignment, astronomical alignment of monuments, and the keeping the annals of royalty and so forth. So there is no question at all that the ancient Egyptians placed women and women divinity, or the concept of women divinity, at a very, very high position. Now, why did it change? I think we have to look elsewhere. The change stems from from the biblical events. There's no question that the Old Testament presents us with a patriarchal society, led by men that make law and decide and communicate indeed with the divinity. So I think that's where the change occurred, and perhaps I should say that one of the reasons Egypt is very attractive to women in particular. I conduct tours in Egypt, as you know, Hillary, and many women do come, mainly because they feel that somehow they are connecting again with aspects of human civilization that has been lost. And they feel very comfortable there. I mean, they suddenly feel in a very feminine environment. They see themselves reconnecting to like you could say, a matriarchal society where women were very dominant, were very free. What I was saying is that more than 3,000 years ago, Egypt was ruled by a woman pharaoh, Hatshepsut, and 2,000 years ago, a little bit more than that, was Cleopatra. This has not occurred in Western Europe till much later, and indeed in some Western countries we still do not have women rulers.
Now, so, Robert, I have to cut you off here for a second, because Hatshepsut is a very personal interest of mine, and I'm curious if you feel that her story has been misunderstood. Do you feel that she was perhaps trying to bring back that connection that was perhaps lost before her?
Bringing back the connection, I'm not quite sure. I think the high position of women was very, very well established in Egypt. I think what was unknown, or at least as far as we know from historical records, was that a queen could rule alone without a pharaoh. She established that precedent. But they seem to have accepted it very, very well. So it seems that there was no resistance to this. There seems to have been some resistance from her successor, eventually to Moses III. But the idea was quite well absorbed in Egypt. I mean, one can see this from the amazing legacy that she left, the great temple of Deir el-Bahari. And various others. She contributed, for example, to the construction of the Temple of Karnak, which only pharaohs had done so far. So,
yeah, I like your you were talking before we lost you and had to reestablish the connection about women, present day women who go back to Egypt and experience this connection. And I'd like to comment on that and talk a little bit about how the queen or the priestess would feed the pharaoh blue lotus, and lotus flowers were a very strong symbol, and they're seen throughout the entire area of Egypt and in all the different temples, and it was a very important symbol. And I believe women, when they go back to Egypt, they feel a sense of coming home to themselves, and they also can connect to the divine feminine, but they also realize a connection to the divine male, which I think the balance of the two was very important in these cultures. And I'm curious, Tom, you have a wonderful concept that you call psycho-spiritual growth, and I'm curious if you feel this personally while you walk through these old places. Both of you can comment on that and what your thoughts are about that.
Well, sure. Make a quick comment. I like and use in my teaching sometimes the work of Ken Wilber on integral developmental philosophy, integral developmental theory, which suggests that these various stages and states of being, both individually and culturally, have always existed, including the stages that we might call higher stages that equally honored and equally balanced and honored the divine feminine and divine masculine, have always existed, and it's sort of people, or individuals, and subgroups have always tapped into those structures, stages, and it's the dominant external culture, political events that have sort of descended, or, as you suggested, moved into a lopsided vein in recent centuries and millennia. So, yeah, and then and when we visit when I visit these temples, I think we can definitely feel a connection.
Robert, would you care to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to take this on a slightly different direction. I firmly believe that men and women are endowed with archetypes, and that each woman has within her a variety of archetypes. One of them being, and I believe the strongest, the most sublime, is the goddess. This notion of being specially connected with the divine, having healing powers, having the ability to heal and to teach. The Egyptians recognized this very early, and you always see divinities in the role of nurturing and teaching and healing. So when you go to Egypt, unfortunately I'm not a woman, so I can't experience that strongly, but certainly I see it in women who come there, that they immediately feel at home. They're in an environment. I'm talking about ancient Egypt, of course. When they enter temples, they sense that they are in an environment that was very much in the way that they like to see themselves, that they feel they are in that way, and that they don't feel that in the Western world. It's very obvious. And they develop a great connection, a great desire to be in those kind of environments. And some women just love staying in temples and experiencing that mood of the feminine. So ancient Egypt is very, very geared for that. It's perhaps one of the only cultures I know that has focused intensely on the feminine powers the godly, the goddess powers. And to me, there are certain temples, for example, that express this very powerfully. The temple
Don't you
of
feel
Sila.
that when they walk into a temple, they feel their connection back to the earth? We're looking up all the time, looking at the connections to the stars, but what women really feel when they go into these temples is a connection back to the earth. Don't you agree?
Well, women are the carriers and the creators of life. I mean, they give birth. And therefore the connection to nature and to the earth is extremely powerful. I think it's something that is very, very much within their whole being, their psychic and their nature, and is totally connected to this. So it's not surprising that if placed in an environment such as Egypt, where this connection was extolled, was venerated, was exposed, rather than detached, then women immediately feel relinked, feel plugged in again, and that's how I see ancient Egypt. Although the civilization is no more there, the sockets are there, if you like, and women can plug themselves again and feel what truly they should feel, this powerful connection with the earth. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Now, these cultures that you've been exploring, are of shamanistic origins, yes?
You're asking me or Tom?
Either one of you, if you'd like to comment. Tom, we can start with you.
Well, sure. I think we could say that. Actually, in the book Black Genesis, we mention, and we describe visiting in the deep desert, Gebel Owainat and Kabir regions, the ancient cave art, rock art sites, and some of them clearly have what appear like shamanic imagery. In fact, one of them I started calling the Cave of the Shamans because it had such clear imagery, shamanic ritual-like imagery. A shaman, human figure emerging out of the head of a wild animal and this sort of thing.
Robert?
Yeah, I like. Yes, I'm glad you brought this up, Tom, because I think we should also say that when we did go there, and let me explain. I mean, it sounds sort of very easy, but in fact, when Tom and I connected in Egypt and we had a small expedition team, it took us 5 days with 4-wheel drive to actually reach those remote areas. And by the time you get there, you've lost everything to do with modern civilization. I mean, there's absolutely nothing in the environment at all that reminds you or brings any notion of modern civilization. You're there with nature in its very primordial form. In these areas of the Sahara, you feel like you're at the earth when the earth was born. It's a very strange feeling. And I think that even though we didn't stay that long, we began to very much connect instinctively with nature, which is the first step of shamanism in my view. We began to feel linked, and I use the word plugged in. Maybe that's perhaps a better term. We at night, for example, we sensed very much the cosmic environment, the stars, the whole mood of the place engulfed us. And I remember that night. I don't know if you remember that as much as I do, Tom, when we were at the Gilsi Kibir, and we went in one of those caves where there was a lot of rock art, the famous cave of swimmers.
Yeah.
And we stayed there for a while at night, in the darkness of the night, and watching the stars. And there was this amazing sense of feeling something that we didn't feel before. I never felt it before, is the sense of cosmic connection, and that if one could understand this, one could somehow achieve higher levels of the self. So to me, it's not surprising at all of what you said earlier, Tom, that the people that lived in those areas for throughout their lives were in fact very much in a shamanic mood. I think also ancient Egypt, by the way, but certainly there one sees it in their drawings, one sees it in the whole atmosphere of the place.
Yeah, when you and Hillary were talking a few minutes ago about the feeling of connection with earth and sky in the temples, in the Nile temples, I was thinking of that as recreating what we experienced in the deep desert, sort of naturally, that you're confronted with. Perhaps those Nile temples sort of recreate that connection with earth and sky, both that one is confronted with out in the deep desert.
I have a vision of people, women, men, both coming to the temples, reconnecting with the earth, and then perhaps reconnecting to the cosmos because of that connection. We are out of time, and I would like to thank both my guests for joining me, and Robert, for people who are interested in your tours and also more information about your new book, what's the best way to get in touch with you? Your website?
The best way is by website. Yeah, let me give the website. It's www.robertbauval.co.uk. And I usually say do not go to .com because you'll find a hijacked site which shows pornographic material. So that's not me. Mine is .co.uk. And yes, Black Genesis is coming out, by the way, in April. Tom and I feel we've done a great job putting it together, and it will appear first in the United States, by the way.